checking we started recording. Welcome everybody to the last in our series of conversations about the Bible study series, How the Bible Can Help Us Understand. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by Denise Cottrell-Boyce again, and we'll be talking about her study guide, Welcoming the Stranger.
Robot thing.
So if I could ask people to remember to mute your mic, and I'm just trying to get on speaker. Can I just check, can people see me?
Yes.
Yes, because I don't have my helpful assistant this week, so it's a bit difficult to see what's happening. Okay, so tonight I am talking to Denise Cottrell-Boyce about Welcoming the Stranger, and what I'm first going to do is I will introduce Denise to you, and then will give us a few words about the Bible series study. Could I ask people to have their mics off, please, because I can hear some feedback, and then we will go into the conversations like we've had every week. So I'm just admitting a couple more people in. So tonight I have with me Denise Cottrell-Boyce, who is going to be talking to us about her Bible study guide, Welcoming the Stranger. Denise is a Catholic writer. She has written. She often writes for sort of the Sunday news sheet, and this is, I think, your first book. Is that right, Denise?
Yes.
And Denise is also, we were just talking before we started, Denise has recently written a kind of online nativity for schools to be used during Christmas, which has been very popular. And she's also, which is kind of the fruit of this book, she has been a volunteer worker at a local refugee charity in Liverpool where she lives. And that's formed the basis of her thinking about this book. So before I hand over to you, Denise, I'm going to ask Will to talk to us a little bit about the Bible study series, Welcoming the Stranger. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, Will, that would be really helpful.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Virginia, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. My name's Will, and I work for Darton, Longman and Todd. We're the publisher of the How the Bible Can Help Us Understand series, and also the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, on which the series is based. Start with a quote from Pope Francis. The Bible, he says, is not a collection of books for the benefit of a privileged few. It belongs to those called to hear its message and to recognize themselves in its words. And the new How the Bible Can Help Us Understand series is designed to help us explore these words together for today. There are 4 books in the series. Each one is a discussion about an important aspect of our lives that asks what the Bible tells us about it and how the Bible can deepen our understanding of it. 3 books in the series have been published already, and they're available to buy at the moment in pocket-sized paperback and as ebooks. There's Forgiveness. I'll try and get these up to the camera. Forgiveness by Frank Cottrell-Boyce. There's Approaching the End of Life by Virginia. There's Illness, Disability and Caring by Bernadette Meaden, that was discussed last week, if anyone was on that call. And as I just alluded to, one by one, every Wednesday in January to date, these books and the themes they explore in relation to our lives and what the Bible has to say about them have been covered in conversation between Virginia and in her role as the series editor and the authors. You can find these conversations on our YouTube channel. So as I said, there's already been Forgiveness, and that was discussed between Virginia and Frank Cottrell-Boyce, Approaching the End of Life. Frank interviewed Virginia about that, and last week, as some of you will know, illness, disability and caring. Bernadette Meaden's book was discussed by Virginia and also Denise. The fourth book in the series, which was delayed by the pandemic and is to be released in the summer, in July, is Welcoming the Stranger, and that's by Denise. And that, of course, will form the basis of tonight's discussion. The conversation will also appear on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Each book in the series can either be read privately or as part of a small study group. Each book is between 5-6 chapters, and the authors offer thoughts and questions for reflection, prayers, and suggestions for considering the topic in question more deeply. The guides in the series are aimed at ordinary people, committed in their faith and wanting to live Christianly, but not necessarily brought up in a Bible studying tradition. We hope they'll prompt intelligent thought, reflection, and guidance on some of the issues that really matter to us today. And you can find more about them on our website, dltbooks.com, and I'll post a couple of links in the chat as the evening progresses. And there you go. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Will. And just before we move on to talk about Denise, I just wanted to point out these beautiful covers. I've been meaning to say this every week, that the beautiful covers link to the actual cover of the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, and they've been designed by Judy Linnard with the little sketch drawings by Carol Vincer. And I wanted to just mention them because often designers get missed out, and they're a really important part of the book, and DLT's got some really brilliant designers, and I've always appreciated the work they've done for my books, so thank you for that. So I'm going to hand you over to Denise. I'm just trying to change the view so we can see Denise. Denise, I'm going to ask you if you would to tell us a little bit about your experience of the Bible, and I'm going to try and do something clever because I'm not spotlighting on you at the moment, so I'm going to spotlight on you so we can see you. There you go, we've got Denise. Thank you. So I'm just starting off, as I've started off every week, with, can you tell us about your experience of the Bible through your life, and how has writing this book changed your understanding of it?
So I started reading the Bible at a very young age because our school had a beautiful library that went down the corridor, the main corridor. And when they started it, they bought 10 volumes of a children's Bible, and it was really beautiful and beautifully illustrated. And I was a bit of a loner at that time of my life, and so I systematically went through the lot. So before I hit 11, I had gone through the whole Bible, which actually gave me a bit of an advantage, because when I went to secondary school, I was sort of struggling quite a lot, but I was very good at RE, and that was it was something to hold on to because it was what I was good at, and ultimately it led me to reading theology at university. So it's always been a friend and companion, and in fact I bought this. This is my Bible, and it's held together with gaffer tape. It's very grubby. It's been with me. My friends gave it to me when I was 18, and it's one of my most treasured possessions, not physically, but also because it's been a great source of strength. It's a great treasure in my life.
That's lovely, and I love the fact it is so battered and it's so personal, because I think that's how a Bible should be. Can you tell us about what it was like to write this book, and what your experience of doing that was? Has it changed anything?
I mean, it was really great because it gave me a job to do. You know, you have your Bible by your bed or whatever, and you use it. But Will was saying that the Bible helps us to deal with difficult issues. But also I found doing the book, it showed me that difficult issues can also create a way of introducing the Bible into our lives, or using the Bible more in our lives. I know a lot of people that say I should read the Bible more, and I want to read the Bible more. And because it's so precious to me, I want people to read the Bible more. But they quite often say, well, I started with Genesis, and usually mine's very concise. It's got very thin pages, but your Bible, I think, is big. And it looks so daunting before you start. And so to say, here's a subject that I'm very interested in, I'm exercised by illness or disability. I struggle with the concept of welcoming the stranger. To say, well, use that as a channel through the Bible, then the Bible is helping you understand the issue, but the issue is also helping you use the Bible in its most effective way. And then it's like anything, the more familiar it becomes, the more you accidentally find passages. And also, I mean, every time you read a passage in the Bible, you will find something in it that you've never noticed before. Even one of the passages we're going to talk about in a moment. Last night I saw something in it that I'd never seen before, and I found it very emotional, actually.
Yeah, that's it. That is something that's amazing about the Bible for that purpose. So the next question I've got is kind of kicking off with the first chapter in your book, really, and that is all about being a stranger in a strange land. And I think you start off with a very beautiful part, Psalm 37, the Song in Exile. So perhaps you could sort of talk us through a little bit about why you started there, and what does it mean to be a stranger in a strange land?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people will know that psalm. It's by the river, by the
Rivers of Babylon.
Sorry,
That's okay.
About Babylon, we hung up our lyres. It's Psalm 137, and it describes the fate of the exiled. The people of Israel were attacked by the Babylonians. They were besieged for 3 years. The city was razed to the ground. Everything was destroyed. Social order was destroyed. Everything was just horrendous. And then the people were taken away, physically taken away, and forced to live in exile in Babylon. And suddenly they were strangers. They looked odd. Everybody knew they were strangers. Their language was different. Their clothes were different. Their food was different. Everything, their religion was different. And they were so wretched. And this psalm describes the ridicule that the Babylonians said to them, oh, why don't you sing some of your songs? And what they said, and this is the bit I read last night, was, we hung up our lyres, the lyres that we used to praise God, the lyres that we used to celebrate all our feasts and in Thanksgiving. And we hung them up on the willows by the river where it's damp. If you've got a beautiful musical instrument, you keep it dry. You don't hang it up in a damp place where it warps. And they rendered their lyres actually useless rather than be forced to use in a belittling way. And I just never noticed the fact that it was by a river before. And when I did, I just thought, and that really expresses that sense of, that self-destructive sense of utter desolation that you can feel. I mean, they were in a very bad situation, but any migrant actually, quite often getting to a place takes up all your energy and imagination. And then when you arrive, it's quite often, even if you come in optimum circumstances, can be very different. And that shock of not belonging can be a very terrible experience.
Yes, definitely. And I think you go on to explore, why people come in the first place. And I think you go into the Psalm 142, which is a much more kind of crueler sort of sense of being alone. But also you talk you cite Lamentations, which is a bit of the Bible I was really unfamiliar with. And I'm very grateful for you to introduce me. Tough going, very painful. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, because at least the people in the exile, they moved as a group, and they had that solidarity of the group, which we'll talk about in a moment. But also for a lot of people, particularly migrants coming to our country, they're quite often young single men, and quite often, again, we live in a very modern, very secular, very, very individualistic society, whereas actually, for most people in the world, they live in great big families. They live in very religious communities where there's lots of communal activity, and that isolation of being away from anybody that knows you. And there's just two lines in that Psalm 142. There is no one who pays me heed, no one who cares for my soul. That idea of just, you're there and nobody cares whether you're there or not. Nobody notices you. You're either invisible or at best invisible, at worst perhaps an object of derision if you find yourself coming into contact with people who are who have their own issues actually. And then I did talk about the example of a young man called Tesfaye, who's from Eritrea, and he put himself into the hands of people carriers, people traffickers, and he found himself, he did this very, very long journey. He didn't really know where he was or what he was doing. And one morning he found himself alone in Finsbury Park, just on the side of the road in Finsbury Park, and didn't know what to do or how to get help. And actually, by the grace of God, he would have said, and I would have said, I suppose, he eventually sort of walked into a shop, and the person in the shop was from Eritrea. And so he went through the asylum process. But the description of his loneliness and his alienation is so extreme. I mean, he experienced extreme mental health issues. Sometimes he would just literally just lie down on the floor. I mean, he looked drunk or whatever. And then eventually he did get some accommodation, but it was in a sort of hotel hostel thing, and it was a lot of drug dealers and prostitutes, and he was very disorientated. So he used to stay in his room. There was a kitchen, but he was too scared to go in the kitchen. So he used to boil pasta in his kettle, just switching the kettle on and then letting it boil for 3 minutes and then switching the kettle on again. And actually, he also talks very eloquently about that sense of once you've gone, once you've left what's behind, it changes and you change. So it's a bit like you were pieces of a jigsaw that joined together, but as the edges of each of you change a little bit, if you do go back, if you do reconnect, you never quite reconnect. So once you are in exile, you're sort of always going to be in exile, so you don't fit in one community and you don't quite fit where you came from either. So it is a very, very hard experience. And actually, I mean, we lived in France for a year, about 15 years ago. And we were there in optimum conditions. I mean, we chose to go there. We were close to home. We could have gone back anytime we wanted to. Family were going backwards and forwards. We were in a nice place. Our friends, our children's friends, their parents loved them practicing English. Our parish was lovely. People were welcoming. And still, we felt stupid. We felt conspicuous. We made mistakes. We felt insecure. We felt very, very insecure, and we felt very childish. And I think we probably sounded childish as well. I know some asylum seekers who speak incredibly good English, but even a tiny little mistake. So I've got a friend who says, thanks God. Now she's really fluent English. She's a very intelligent woman, but just about that, every time she says thanks God, she sounds a little bit funny. And I know that I speak very fast, and so I will just sort of speak French very fast. And I'm quite careless about grammar and all sorts of things. So I think I probably sound very childish when I'm speaking French. Like, I'm not used to thinking of myself. I'm used to thinking of myself as matriarch, and I had a very privileged education. Being in a place where people, even when they're being nice to you, being slightly patronizing, it's very hard actually to take. I mean, it's the smallest violin in the world, but it did make me think it was that difficult. And in fact, there was an incident where I did actually have a miscarriage, and I felt so insecure about being able to explain my situation to a French gynecologist. I just couldn't bring myself to go to hospital. And I just actually had a miscarriage at home because I didn't feel confident that I could negotiate the French medical system in a way which I'd be very confident about doing here. So if somebody like me in that kind of situation still does quite eccentric things like that, you can imagine how extreme it is when you're banished from your home, when home is dangerous, and where you are now doesn't really want you to be here. It's a very distressing, emotional place to be in.
Yeah, and I think that's a very powerful story that you tell. And I think one of the things that makes it really powerful is that it's your personal experience, and you kind of make it, you can show how it can happen to any one person. And last week we were talking about illness and disability, and one of the things I think that really strikes me is I got really involved in thinking about those issues because I started thinking, well, this could happen to me. I could become ill. A friend of mine had recently died. It makes you kind of start thinking. And so I think it's really powerful that that experience that you had made you start thinking about refugees and welcoming the stranger. And I think that the message of Matthew 25 that we entered with last week, you know, that when I was a stranger, you welcomed me, is a really, really urgent and important one, because of precisely what you said, the loneliness, the struggle, the mental health issues, the terrible situations people are coming from. And yet it's not always that easy. And I think in your second chapter, you talk a lot about fear and people's sort of sense of fear of the stranger. And you kick us off with Joseph. And so perhaps you could start telling us a little bit about Joseph.
Again, that's quite a familiar text. We've seen Joseph. Well, it's not Joseph actually. It's the bit that comes up. Yeah, so we know Joseph, and we know that's a lovely story with a happy ending, and Joseph comes out on top, and his dad comes to Israel, and his brothers come to Egypt, and they all come, and they get the nice land and everything. And then you start at the beginning of Exodus, and it's all gone terribly wrong. And it's suddenly the Israelites are not on top anymore. In fact, they're really downtrodden. There's the Pharaoh's being horrible to them. They want to escape and go to a promised land, and you know, we know that story as well. But there's a great disjuncture between the two, and actually, that's because because of some big set pieces in Exodus, we kind of sometimes don't read the opening few paragraphs. And I start with the opening paragraphs because it describes Pharaoh and the Egyptians as being very afraid of the Israelites, because in the intervening years, they've reproduced, and their numbers are quite large, and they were quite large. I mean, they were by the beginning of the story, a quarter of the population were Israelites, whereas the original group that came were 70 people. So there had been a big jump. And what Pharaoh expresses is fear, and this fear is that, you know, there's so many of these people, soon there's going to be more of them than there are of us. And there's that also is that sense that they're like a fifth column. They're here, but they're not us. They've got a different allegiance. They're not Egyptians. They've got a different religion. And that's something, I mean, you know, we as Catholics, those of us who are Catholics, we were a very suspicious group. Down to the fact, when I was a student, I had a friend who came from the evangelical tradition, and he said when he was a child, his mother said, you can go into any church, but not a Catholic church. Don't go into a Catholic church. He's actually a Catholic priest now, so I'm sure his mother has sold herself to Catholics in the intervening years. But as recently as that idea of people who look the same, or maybe don't look the same, but people who are here, and they seem to do the same things as us, but they're not quite us. So that fear is expressed, and then also the miscommunication. So in the passage, the Pharaoh decides that the best way to make sure they're not overpowered, and actually he obviously doesn't have an objection to Israelites, it's just Israelite men. So maybe it's that sort of thing that maybe they will create an uprising or something. So his solution is tell the midwives sort of to check the babies, and the minute I'm assuming stones means testicles, but check for the stones, he says. I think it says that in both translations. And then if it's a boy baby, kill the boy baby. Now the midwives are Hebrew midwives, and they don't want to kill the boy babies. They also don't want to get into trouble with Pharaoh. So he calls them back and says, you're not killing any boy babies, there's as many as ever. And they say, yes, that's because Hebrew women are so strong and so good at childbearing. We can't get there in time. They've already had the babies before we can get there. So this sort of misalignment starts to, this suspicion and fear gets worse, because Pharaoh thinks, oh my goodness, these women, they're bragging about how incredibly great at childbearing they are. And that just reinforces this idea that these foreigners within our midst, they're different to us, and they're stronger than us, and they're actually going to have more children than us. And all the midwives are doing is thinking, don't execute us because we're not obeying your will. They're trying to save their own lives, and he thinks that they're giving him even more inside information about this sort of dangerous situation. And I think it's a great illustration of how fear and misunderstanding and miscommunication can exacerbate problems. You know, most asylum seekers or people who are fleeing from economic despair are here because of problems, and quite often the people who have a problem with them being here, they have their own problems, or by and large, roughly speaking, they have their own problems. And really, it's too simplistic to say these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, because actually it's really not like that. And the biggest problem people have is not being able to communicate, and finding a forum, of finding situations where people can communicate. That's really the way forward. And I think that's what, people who are really, committed to social harmony, that's really what they're trying to engender.
And and I think on the other hand, we also have people who take the opposite view, and they're trying to stir up xenophobic feelings, because that, I think you sort of say in the book, in a way it is natural to sort of fear the unknown and fear the other, because it's something's different from us, and we all have our comfort zones. And so Pharaoh being frightened of the Hebrews because they're not quite them, and there's also probably a bit of resentment with Joseph's descendants having money and maybe having taken resources, but then the myth set up. And I think one of the things you've mentioned in the book was that the Egyptians had this myth of how many Hebrews there were, and there weren't nearly as many as the Israelites say. And we still see that now today. If you get all this kind of nonsense about we're being overrun by this group of people or that group of people, and if you actually look at the figures, no, we're not. I mean, I think it's something like 80% of the country is still white. That's still the predominant. So there's no sense that any smaller they are minorities. So there's no way that a minority is going to overtake or change our culture. But being in our culture is a challenge to us.
We're an island nation. We are actually all in. I mean, I think I can't remember which chapter I mentioned it, but when I began writing this, I was talking about current migration, and literally I'd sort of forgotten that I'm from a migrant family. My mum is Irish, and in fact, although my dad's English, the culture I grew up in was this little cocoon of Irish Catholics. So I'm fairly sure that my older sister and I probably had Irish accents when we went to school, because we didn't go to K group. My mum and my auntie lived around the corner from each other. They were Irish. Everybody in our parish was Irish. We had 4 Irish priests. My dad was, a traditional dad. He'd go out to work before we went to school in the morning. He'd come home sort of latish. We didn't really mix that much before we were 5 with English people. And also, we have this expression. I mean, I don't think anyone uses it anymore, but we used to have this expression, non-Catholics, and non-Catholic, just this sort of vague, insignificant, peripheral group, and it was the rest of the world, but it was so significant to us. And they could include Anglicans and Jews and Wycomists and just anybody at all that didn't really go to St. Teresa's parish in Perry Bar. So it was a very limited worldview, but it was a lovely environment to live as well. There is something, and this is one of I'll go into this a bit later, but this is one of the reasons people don't like change is not necessarily because they don't like other people, but because they're contented, because they're happy, because the world they live in is a pleasant place to be. And if you are happy, then you are nervous. Why would you want things to change? Because if things change, they may change for the worse. They may change for the worse. So it's not illogical that people do.
Is she speaking now?
No, sorry, somebody's just come on the call. Could you turn off your mic? If you just come on the call, could you turn off your mic, because it's
No, not me.
Joan, if you could turn off your mic, please. Sorry.
You are.
Grandma, you need to mute yourself.
Oh, but you've got to get your ticket.
I'm muting you. That's it. I think I've muted that. So sorry, Denise. If we can go back to.
Well, just merely, I think I was reiterating the point that it's not illogical if the status quo is a warm and happy and contented place to be. That you don't want to take a punt on things changing. So it's not always a negative thing. It can be an expression of contentment, which is
And I think also the other thing that you sort of end up the chapter with is that strangers kind of make us afraid of the unknown.
Yes.
But also you say the unknown.
It creates cohesion. So it's that sort of paradox. When we feel there's an outsider, it makes us cling to each other and makes us feel safe, and it gives a periphery to our identity, but also it kind of makes us feel insecure. So it's that thing, we need strangers, we fear strangers because for all sorts of reasons we feel threatened, but also strangers also give us a sense of coherence and identity. And I think the example I used from our experience was that when we were living in France, one of our children was in a class, and he got quite badly bullied at one stage, and the child who was bullying him was a child who'd been adopted from Vietnam. And I thought, and actually his parents were just brilliant about it. We all went to the same church, and so I was able to talk to him about it. And the situation was that because he looked different to the other children in his class, he'd been raised in France, but because he looked different, he was the butt of some teasing and bullying. And then when my son arrived in the class, suddenly
Somebody else.
he didn't speak French, so he stood out, and suddenly this child who'd always been on the outside, for the first time he was in the inside, and he could only stay on the inside if my son stayed on the outside. And so that is something that kind of does happen subconsciously. I mean, I think, Hitler did it in the way, I'm sure there were lots and lots of people, there's lots of class division and lots of, personal division and lots of family division, but, lots of people talking quite sort of nostalgic terms about that sense of togetherness and cohesion that they felt during the First World War, because there was an outside enemy, and so they all snuggled up together.
Yeah, and I think we went from that, and I think we'll just move into the next question in a minute. But that actually, luckily, the kingdom of heaven is bigger than all of us,
yes.
And there's room for all of us, and that's the challenge, the kingdom of heaven, and that's why welcoming the stranger is so important, because it's saying just because that person feels strange to us doesn't mean that they're not part of God's kingdom. And I always love the image of the mustard seed as for God's kingdom, because there's room for everybody in the mustard seed branch.
There is room for everybody, but the truth is there's the ideal, which is the kingdom of heaven that we're all living in or aspiring to live in, and then there's our weakness, and so it's a constant tension. And actually our weakness, when we fail, and if we're honest and if we examine our consciences, the moments of failure are when we most need to call on God's help. And I think that's the point, that the kingdom of heaven, people do sleep outside, and the shepherd keeps bringing us back, and the shepherd keeps bringing us back. But I did want to make very strong the point that quite often the kingdom, we tend to think of radical inclusion, meaning radically including the outsider, the stranger, the migrant. But real radical inclusion means including the person who doesn't like the stranger, including the person who writes racist graffiti, including the kingdom of heaven is so embracing and so radical that we have to embrace what appears to us the loveless. There isn't anybody outside the kingdom. The minute you start saying, I love all these people, and we do I do sometimes think that I have a tendency to find it very easy to love vulnerable people. It's easy to love vulnerable people. It's, I'm sure that if with a bit of effort, I could have hugged a leper. But actually, I find it really quite hard to love people who have got more power or more wealth or more, very different political opinions to me. That's my struggle. And each one of us, to make the kingdom come, we have to really address our own personal struggle and ask for help.
Yeah. And I think just moving on from that sort of into the kind of the nub of what we're talking about here in terms of some of the tensions about, it's hard to welcome the stranger when we're frightened of the stranger, but also what happens when communities are really stretched and they're asked to welcome strangers. And again, you start with the story of Ruth, and you show what's possible, but then you move on and talk about where it's difficult and it's painful. So I don't know whether you want to just maybe talk about that,
because it's a very vivid, it's a lovely book. I hope that at the end of this, you're all going to go and run home and read some of these stories. So Ruth is like, I think it was originally had a long oral tradition, because there are some, I don't want to get too textual, but there are some pieces of it that you can sort of see little overlapping stories. But It's just this very vivid story about a young Moabite widow that comes into Bethlehem, actually. She comes to Bethlehem with her Hebrew mother-in-law. They're both widowed. And she comes home and, there's a bit of stir and a bit of murmur. Here's this strange, this strange young woman coming to town. She's a foreigner. And then she and her mother-in-law are both widows. They're very poor. They have to throw themselves on the mercy of a relative, a distant relative. And it's a kind of fairy tale story, because the distant relative they throw themselves on the mercy of is a very rich person, Boaz. He's a very, very affluent person. And he eventually marries her, and then she's got a status in the community, and it's all very happily ever after. But you can't really understand the full import of this story unless you know how absolutely reviled the Moabites were in Israelite culture. There was nobody that they would rather spit on than a Moabite. So like a Moabite, a story that really enhances the status of a Moabite woman is very, very unusual. And also, it's not just a fairy tale ending, because Ruth becomes the great grandmother of King David, the great and glorious beloved King David. So actually, the stranger and outsider, she becomes a mother of the nation. So it's an extraordinarily generous and embracing story. And it's very inspiring. But as you say, one person coming in is one thing. If you are living, so I should explain the situation. Most asylum seekers kind of imagine that they're going to end up in London, I think. I mean, that's the impression I get. And a lot of asylum seekers and migrants go to London. Once they get involved in the asylum process, they're nearly always housed where housing stock is available. And where housing stock is most available now is in the depopulated post-industrial cities, quite a lot of them in the north of England. I know there are other places. Liverpool has been a city that's been in decline for just decades. And so huge numbers of asylum seekers came to Liverpool, also to Newcastle and to Glasgow as well. And they came to places where people already felt pretty bad about it. I mean, not just that people in Liverpool, but people in the most depopulated places of Liverpool, places that when I first moved to Liverpool would have boarded up houses. I mean, it's hard, if you live in the south of England, you can't quite imagine that beautiful Victorian houses, rows and rows of beautiful Victorian houses with 4 or 5 bedrooms would be boarded up, but they were in these areas. And so these were the obvious places to send asylum seekers. But the communities they went to already had quite a lot of problems. They had intergenerational unemployment, the depression and the mental and physical health problems that go with them, lack of aspiration, lack of aspiration, not because people couldn't be bothered to be aspire, but like when your aspirations have been slashed down and slashed down and slashed down and slashed down, you give up on aspiration. So that's what I mean. And then churches and communities really work hard to work with the people that are in these communities and to sustain hope and to give purpose and to give life to these communities. But it's really hard. And then all of a sudden, because there was a mass increase of migration very, very quickly in the beginning of this century, and with very little preparation, and also the financial crash of 2008. Those two things coming together, all of a sudden, a city that really hadn't had any migration at all. I'm from Birmingham, so it was a real shock to me when I first came to Liverpool and found there was a tiny community, a few tiny communities in one part of the city. But you go into the city centre, you would not see anything but a basically an Irish face. So there was a huge shock to the system, and people felt a sense of resentment. They felt as if all of a sudden things were being given. They'd been told that there was nothing for them. And then all of a sudden resources were being found for all these other people. And in the same way that, the Egyptians were thinking, what's going on here with the Israelites? A lot of people, not irrationally, thought, well, how is it that these people are getting a house and I can't get a house? And housing stock is very poor. Housing conditions, the condition of housing stock is really shocking. And really, you'd end up with a situation where two very, very troubled communities were both sort of fighting and arguing about the most really unattractive and unappealing housing and, very depleted resources in general. So a very difficult situation. migration for all parties.
And I think you kind of describe it as kind of fighting. There's a Bible passage about fighting for the scraps of the table. Did you just
fighting the scraps of it? Yeah, I mean, it was an image. I'd not to use the whole quote because out of context it could sound a bit insulting, but yes, the Syrophoenician woman asks Jesus to cure her daughter, and he says, well, you know, I've got to feed, shouldn't I be feeding the children of Israel first? And she says, but even the dogs are entitled to have the scraps on the table. But it's that idea that there's that you know, at the end of the day, no matter how positive you feel about migration, there are lots of very positive things for the whole country about migration, but as Darren Garvey says later on in Poverty Safari, just because something is good for the whole country doesn't mean it's specifically good for the community in which the asylum seekers and the migrants come. And some things are good and some things are not good, but it's not just a universal bland goodness that spread itself evenly all over the place. So essentially, you can have a community that is welcoming and is a country that is welcoming and accommodating. You know, we provide housing and legal help and support to people who are fleeing from distress, and that's a very positive thing that we should feel proud about. But at the same time, we can't deny that for some people that is taking the little that they have, because all asylum seekers are placed in the most vulnerable communities, the communities that have the worst housing, the communities that have the worst health, the communities that have the highest death, well, not the highest death rate, but you know, I can't remember the expression, the lowest morbidity. Actually, I was going to say the differential in dying. I can't remember that expression. They die earlier than everybody else. That's the bluntest way of saying it. So that, you know, on every level, they're already the most disadvantaged, and they're the community who said are told that they've got to share. Come on, well, you know, it's like saying giving all your children a chocolate bar and giving one child a block of chocolate, and then saying to that child, "Come on, share that block of chocolate. Why are you being so naughty? Why aren't you being generous?" Why, you know, we're expecting vast amounts of generosity from the people who have least.
And I think that's another problem, and I think it's we were talking about the aspiration for the kingdom of heaven to be for everybody. I think it's very easy for me. I mean, I live in Oxford, which is a nice it's wealthy parts and poverty-stricken parts, and one of the things I think is great about Oxford is actually it's part of the country where migrant population is actually spread very evenly across the area, and if you look at the demographics of Oxford, it's quite unusual in that most areas there isn't one particular ghetto, which you have in many other places. But I sit in my nice middle class house in my nice middle class street, and I'm not having to share my resources, and where resources had to be developed, there has been some thinking going on, and some areas do think we do need to have more housing, we do need to have more education, and that's the problem. It's not necessarily the problem about the two communities, it's actually the communities need more. And I think the other thing that I think is quite interesting is actually, even with all of that, sometimes it is poorer places that actually are instinctively more generous, like the Widows' Mite. And one of the things I think that came out of Brexit that was really interesting was the most negative populations to migration were actually communities where there weren't any migrants. And it was back to that kind of fear.
Well, it's the fear of change. Yes, if it's a nice comfortable, you're thinking, well, you know, things are going pretty well here. Do you actually want things to change? But actually, I mean, in the midst of the terrible crisis of the COVID pandemic, we are talking about these things, and we're talking about them a lot more. I mean, we're saying up front that, you know, it's BAME communities that are suffering more from infections and deaths. We're saying that poor families are under-resourced to educate their children at home. A light is being shone very, very brightly, and nobody can really quite escape talking about these things that everyone's sort of vaguely known that they're happening, but you know, apparently that is the world at one. You know, at the end of on Radio 4 they have that is the world at one, and the world at one for most of the years I've been listening to it has been about a lot of subjects, but it's very rarely been day after day after day after day talking about the health of the poorest people in our nation, the education education of the poorest people of our nation, the inequalities in our nation, the inequalities of racial origin and health. And it, you know, if anything good comes out of this, that expression that we're beginning to hear, build back better, I really hope that this opportunity is not wasted.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be really, really good. And I think what you've touched on is that idea that both these impoverished communities have an awful lot in common in terms of lack of autonomy and control and lack of good resource.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I was talking about the book of Job, which we all use. We can't you can't escape from the book of Job, because it's just such an amazing philosophical work, and it really makes you explore the whole relationship between God and man, and our own sense of autonomy and the reality of our ourselves as created beings. And so in that context, Job is a rich man who has all the blessings that a person could have, and at his time, because in Judaism the idea of an afterlife as a place of reward didn't exist, so you could tell how much God loved somebody by how much they had, and Job had loads of children and loads of camels and loads of sheep and loads of everything you could possibly want, and then as a kind of test of his virtue, God takes it away to see if he will still be able to acknowledge that he is God's servant, and that he acknowledges God's right to treat him as he will. And it's a huge philosophical argument, but that sense of all of a sudden somebody losing everything, because it all happens overnight, it just is all taken away from him, and he's there just sitting under a tree, just trying to make sense of the world, and everything has gone. And for a lot of asylum seekers, that sense of one moment, you know, a lot of these things happen quite suddenly. Aleppo, there's a piece in the book describing what it was like in Aleppo after the bombing raids. And you know, lots of these people have been living very modern, very similar lives to our own, using the same products that we use and the same, I don't know, computer things that we use, you know, very, very similar. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, their lives are turned upside down. They find themselves in a strange land. They're belittled. They've got no status anymore. Some of them have been quite affluent or quite skilled, have got trades and everything, and now they're like children. They can't speak the language. They have to have secondhand clothes and secondhand bedding and secondhand everything. They're put in the worst houses. And that sense of not, you know, you don't know if you're going to get asylum, so you're not quite sure. Even when you're talking to people, if you don't speak the language, you don't know if the person talking to you with a clipboard is somebody who's making a decision about your asylum status, or just somebody that wants to know whether your children need new shoes. You just don't know, and it's so infantilizing, and it's also so transactional, that whole thing about you must make sure you're not breaking any rules, even though either you don't know what the rules are, or the rules seem strange or downright wrong to you. That whole transactional relationship, unless you behave yourself, unless you sort of do what the people above you, the people with power, the people who are giving you money are telling you to do, you might be in trouble. And quite often people in poor communities have a similar thing. If you're living on benefit, you might get sanctioned, not exclusively, but sometimes for all sorts of cascading reasons. People have more interface with social services, and if you have interface with social services, there's that sort of fear that will they take your children off you. I mean, I've got very close family members who are social workers, and they're the most giving and loving people that just only are I mean, it's not exactly the most, you know, sort of it's not the most well-paid job. You know, you would go into social work because you want to help people, and actually you're quite often viewed by your clients as the child catcher. It's that disjuncture between people's sense of trying to stay below the radar, trying to sort of second guess the rules, trying to obey rules. I mean, an example, actually, I don't use this in the book, but one of the examples that I think is very telling is that most of the women, my drop-in centre was a woman's, most of the women sleep with their children because that's a cultural norm. And in a hot country, if you're only covered with a sheet, that's a very safe thing to do. In this country, it's really top of the list of no-nos to sleep with your child, especially, you know, if you're sleeping under a duvet, it's quite dangerous, and there are all sorts of reasons. So there's a problem because everybody sleeps with their child because that's what you do. But they know that the health visitor will say, "Are you sleeping with your child?" And they'll say, "No," and they'll actually have a cot in the corner of the room. I mean, not everybody, excuse me, I must say, not everybody, but a large number of people will have a cot in the corner of the room, and they'll say, "Yeah, that's where the baby sleeps." And really, that's not where the baby sleeps. And actually, what we need to say is, most people will sleep with their children, so tell them how to sleep safely, because you can sleep safely with a child. You just have to know not to have a big duvet. You have to know not to drink it or take medicine and things like that. And actually being able to say what you really do is by far the best thing to do. And it's a much better, it's a much safer thing to do. But people won't, because they don't know how serious the transgression is of doing something that's a cultural norm for you.
Yeah. So I think that kind of brings us to our last question. I'm sort of conscious that we're slightly over time, but I think it's our last one. So if people don't mind, give us a bit of indulgence, and we'll sort of maybe finish about 10 past rather than 8 o'clock on the dot, if that's okay with people, because that gives time for some questions. So I've got one more last question for you, and then we'll turn over to the audience. And that was something you touched on earlier on. You talked about change, and one of the things we talked about was about the difference between being a first generation immigrant, the people who come in and are welcomed in or not, who struggle in the way that they do, and the second generation who are growing up in the culture, and this, they don't know the home from which their parents have come, but are still seen as differently, but they've got a very different experience from their parents. I just wonder if you could touch a little bit on that.
Yes, I mean, there was a very beautiful film that came out this year, or maybe last year, called Rocks, and it's about a young girl whose mother's a migrant, and she goes to a school in London, and for various reasons she ends up looking after her much younger brother. But there's lots of scenes of her in school, and it's a really beautiful image, a sort of snapshot of a very, well, it appears to anyway, to me, to be a very well-functioning multicultural school where there are children with lots of different traditions. I think she's a Christian, and her friend is a Muslim, and she's got, there are a lot, girls from different backgrounds, and they kind of get it. They get each other's faith. They get each other's different cultural backgrounds, because there's such a lot of them, and they seem to not be threatened. Now, the problem with that for the parents is that's a kind of, they fear that means they'll merge with each other and find harmony through abandoning their culture and faith. And the great challenge for all communities is to create an environment in which you can have cohesion and social harmony, because whether you're the host community or whether you're the incomer, most people are yearning for the same thing. We, as I said before, we're in Ireland. We've had every nationality has come into our country. Our language is so diverse because we've taken it from all over the place, and actually, most people want to live in harmony. Most people want to live in a community where they're known, and they know people, and they look out for people, and people look out for them. But most of certainly of the incoming generation do not want to gain that at the expense of their children being alienated from them, or from their roots, from their culture, from their faith. And that is a very big challenge, because if we don't have those identities, then the common denominator will be materialism. The common denominator will be where we shop, or what televisions and programs we watch, or whatever. And I think most people who are proud of their culture and enriched by their faith do not want their children to lose that. And that desire for unity and diversity at the same time, the most beautiful expression of that is the doctrine of the Trinity, which, as a theological concept, it's a paradox. So it's almost impossible to, if you try to explain it in words. God is three and God is one, then it just doesn't sound as if it makes sense. But in terms of love, in the heart, it makes perfect sense, because in the heart, you understand when you're close to somebody, that you can feel so close to them that the edges sort of disappear. And yet, if it's a really healthy, loving relationship, you will never stop being yourself. So that model of the Trinity of being so united that there's no discord, but so distinct that the richness of your individuality is preserved. That is the ideal. That is the ideal of society, of any society, actually, a family or a greater society. And as Christians, that's the ideal that we aspire to.
Yes, yeah, that's a lovely way to sort of finish on what we've been talking about. I just wondered if anybody had any questions for us in the chat. I know it does take a little while to sort of type them in. So while you're thinking of your questions, I think, Denise, you mentioned that there's a beautiful prayer that you've got at the end of the book, that perhaps you could read that prayer while people are kind of getting their questions in for us.
I have to say, it kind of, how have I got that?
Well,
I can't find that. So actually,
we've got a question. We've got a question anyway. So maybe so we'll look out for the book, because there's a beautiful prayer at the end that Denise has done. So the question is, what do you think can stop us from helping migrants? Where might we look in the Bible to help us get over our inhibitions, fears, and offer what help and support we can? So what do you think stops us from helping, and where can we look in the Bible to get inspiration?
I think what stops us from helping quite often is actually knowing where to help, where to go. So if you feel you should do something, then sometimes we don't know. And actually, first place to look is the church, because the church will have something. So whatever denomination you are, it's unlikely if you live in a place where there are migrants. If you don't live in a place where there are migrants, then it's slightly more difficult. But then there are national organisations. The one I know about is the Jesuit Refugee Service.
Great organisation.
Yes.
What's it called? Jesuit
Refugee Service.
Okay, and they undoubtedly would be able to tell you of something. What was the second part of the question?
The second part was, where might we look in the Bible to get around our inhibitions, fears, and offer what help and support we can?
To be fair, if you read certainly, just the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, frankly, the Sermon on the Mount is usually the answer to quite a lot of problems. In the Sermon on the Mount, it says, just abandon yourself into the arms of God and don't think about what's going to happen. Do the unthinkable. Whatever your inhibitions are as a human being, just let them go. And the other thing is that the absolutely beautiful passage is when Jesus says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged." If you work with any disadvantaged group, they will do or say things that are unpalatable, because if you extreme experiences and extreme poverty and extreme suffering doesn't turn us all into angels. And the thing is, what we need to do is do the right thing. Because what we do shouldn't depend on other people deserving it or not. It shouldn't depend on other people being nice or not. You just do the right thing. You love your enemies. You're good to people who hate you. You seek out to those who need help. And whatever their response is, you just keep doing the right thing. The Sermon on the Mount, can't go wrong.
Yeah, you definitely can't go wrong with the Sermon on the Mount. I would agree with that. And I was just about to share a screen, and I've just done what I did last week and closed it down. So bear with me a minute, because I just wanted to do this before the end of the session. Are there any other questions? Eileen Cole says, "Thank you so much. It was lovely to listen to you, Denise. Well done with this very helpful, inspiring book." And yes, I just want to point out that the inspiring book is not quite written yet, but it's in work in progress, and I've managed to mess up my computer again, so I can't show you an example of it, but I was going to show you an example about it. But I'm trying to get the picture of all the books up, so in a minute I hope I'll be able to do that. No, it's not coming up. My computer's being a pain. Meanwhile, the other thing I just wanted to check with you was, we've been doing a thing each week of just talking about things that have inspired us, books that have inspired us, films, resources we want to point out. And I just wondered if there were any ones that you particularly wanted to highlight that you've referenced in the book.
I mean, there were two books that had some very, very searing images of but actually both groups, but the host group. So Darren Garvey's book Poverty Safari. It's written by he's a rapper. He's a Glaswegian rapper called Loki. That's his rapper name. And he's written this book about living in extreme poverty in Glasgow and his experiences growing up and the challenges he faced. And I mean, it's so arresting. I mean, it's sometimes angry, but it's not pointlessly angry. It's not energy wasting anger, and actually it does end up very positively, but it's riveting, and actually once you start reading it, it's very hard to put it down. And also Caroline Moorhead's book,
Human Cargo, I think you said.
Yes, which is very, I mean, it's great because it's a series of essays, so it's lots of different people. I think it was published in 2008, so you know, things move on and things change, but I think as examples of how, you know, how it actually feels. And also actually Satnam Sangira's two books. He wrote Marriage Material, which is novel, and that's sort of a very, very dramatic description of what it's like to live in a Sikh community. But he also wrote an autobiographical novel which is absolutely extraordinary, called The Boy in the Top Knot. I think the BBC did a film of it. But actually the book, I'd urge anybody to read the book, because I'm from an Irish Catholic family, European, and you know, wouldn't have thought that I would have found so much in common. They were very poor, and my family weren't very poor. But his just expression, his description of living within a community, inside a community, it was so familiar. And also, he kind of takes things that you sort of think you know about from the outside, but they just don't look the same described from within the community and within the situation. In fact, at one point he describes working with his mum and his sisters in a sweat factory, and it's a happy experience. Now, I'm not suggesting that sweat factories are a good thing, but just that it just gives you a much richer and more nuanced and more complicated view of what life is like inside communities that can be very closed off.
Thank you. And I'd like to mention a couple of books, back to children's books again. And I think we can't have this conversation without mentioning that Frank has written a brilliant book about being an experience of a refugee child called The Unforgotten Coat. And I keep mentioning my friend Anne Booth. I'm sorry to be doing it third week running, but I don't know if you've come across Anne's beautiful prose poem Refuge, which is a picture book with illustrations by Sam Usher, and basically it's the story of the flight into Egypt told from the point of view of a donkey, and it's absolutely beautiful, and I highly recommend it, and I think it's doing there. And you've got a comment from somebody who says, "Thank you, Mrs. Cottrell-Boyce. Nice to see you again. You were a very inspiring RE teacher." I've got to mention that with your autobiography that you used to be.
I'm sure you're very inspiring people.
Yeah. The other two things I just wanted to mention was, I think we thank you, Will's mentioned Jesuit Refugee Service, and I also wanted to mention a film that I saw this weekend, which I think also talks about the immigrant experience, which is called Blinded by the Light, and it's the journalist, I think he's Farouk Mansour, I get his name wrong, but it's his life growing up in Luton, kind of fictionalized and romanticized and made into quite a fable, but he basically loved Bruce Springsteen, and that whole tension between his father, who was losing his job at the factory, and his father clinging to the whole past, and really resenting his son wanting to go and be kind of more Western. It's a lovely feel-good film, and it's but it also has a lot of dark stuff in it as well that it deals with quite well. There's a question here which I think links that, which because there's a lot about Nazism in that film, and it says, "I'm confused about who is welcome in the kingdom of heaven. You seem to be saying that pretty much everyone is, regardless of their behaviour, neo-Nazis for instance. Is that what you're saying?"
I'm saying that there is nobody that God can't love So when Jesus takes the woman in adultery, I'll rephrase that. When Jesus saves the woman caught in adultery from stoning, he says to her, "Who has condemned you? I don't condemn you." And then he says, "Go and sin no more." So obviously, you're not saying that somebody who is behaving badly, that you should embrace their bad behavior, but you shouldn't put them into a situation where they only ever meet people who have the same idea. And also, I behave badly. I have behaved badly. In fact, in the book, I kind of describe the way that even thinking of ourselves as being very anti-racist, we're had very patronizing and condescending attitudes to the Ugandan Asians that came to our country. People quite often behave badly without even realizing that that's what they're doing. And quite often people have a sense of loyalty to their group, which expresses itself in a very defensive way. That doesn't mean that what they're doing is wrong, but actually, yeah, Jesus died for the people who were nailing him on the cross. Actually, yeah, I do think God loves everybody. I do think God loves bad people. He doesn't love the bad things they do. But yes,
that's a difference.
Nice people. Then actually, it actually specifically says, if you only love your friends, who doesn't only love their friends?
Yeah, yeah. And thank you, Manuela's pointed out that it's Safraz Manzoor. I knew I'd got his name wrong. The book that Blinded by the Light is based on is Greetings from Berry Park. I'm just going to share the screen because I've found the thing I wanted to share on the screen, just to sort of show, just remind you of the books. I'll just move that up. So these are the 4 books in the series. Forgiveness by Frank Cottrell-Boyce, Approaching the End of Life by me, Illness, Disability and Caring by Bernadette Meaden, and Welcoming the Stranger, which we haven't got in physical form yet, but will be in physical form halfway through the year, so look out for that. It'll be exciting to see it. And I put in the centre the beautiful revised New Jerusalem Bible that's inspired the text of these books, and inspired this series, How the Bible Can Help Us Understand series, and there's a link to DLT books. I would really urge you, in these sort of straitened times, small publishers are really up against it, as are bookshops. So one thing you can do is, if you really enjoyed this series and if you'd like to take these Bible guides, go straight to either DLT's website and order it there, or go to your nearest independent bookshop and order it from them. Please do not use the big bad website that will not be named, because they are taking resources from small communities, and bookshops are real lifeblood for the community. So that's my little passionate plea for bookshops. But that's a reminder of the books that we have. The other thing I just wanted to flag up is this is the last in our series of talks. So thank you for those of us who've been with us each week, and thank you for the ones who've just come tonight. And I hope you've enjoyed them. We videoed them all, so as Will says, they're all up on the DLT website. But I've enjoyed doing this so much that I've decided that I'm going to follow up. So if any of you are interested, 3 years ago I wrote this. This was the first book the second book that got published by DLT. It's a Lent study guide based around the film I, Daniel Blake, called Nothing More and Nothing Less. If you haven't seen the film, it's a really powerful film, and it links to lots of the stuff we were talking last week in Bernadette's book. So I'll be running this through Lent, and I'll be kicking off, if I can get the technology to work. My son is going to teach me how to do a watch party, so hopefully people will be able to watch the film, and then we'll do the Bible study guide in the next few weeks afterwards. So DLT will be publishing that, but I wanted to plug that. I don't know if anybody else has got any things that Denise, is Frank there? Is he hiding? I don't know if you've got anything else you want to plug while you're here in terms of your writing, because I believe you've got a children's book coming out, Frank. Is that right?
Yeah, not till May.
Not till May. So what's the children's book? Just so that if any of you've got children in your life, Frank writes very funny books for children. They're wonderful.
It's called Noah's Gold, and it's about
Noah's Gold, and it's about the internet to start dying or something, is it? Lovely. So I'm glad I've got you in sight, because I also want to say we actually have got on this call, we've got all 4 authors, and I don't know if I can see Bernadette's here, but Bernadette, you don't have to show yourself. Bernadette is on the call as well, so it gives me a huge opportunity to say thank you so much, Frank, Denise and Bernadette, for your brilliant study guides. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to edit them, and also thank you for giving the time and effort to come, because it's, you know, it's a lot to prepare a talk like this and then to give a time and to kind of have the energy. So thank you so much, all of you, for coming and for contributing to this series of events for free, which I really appreciate. And Will and David, who is not here, but from DLT, thank you for all your support, and thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it valuable. And if you're into more Bible study, come and join me in Lent and talking about I, Daniel Blake. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Thank you, Denise, for tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's it. Ta-ra.
Well done.
Well done.